Hello everyone! I want to give you an introduction how PLM change management is handled in SAP S/4HANA. The following functionalities are available in S/4HANA on-premise starting with release 2020 FPS 1, as well as on cloud systems starting with S/4HANA Cloud Edition 2111. In this video, I want to give you an overview what kind of different statuses we are using on a change record and how the setup of a status network is working. I will first show some slides and then jump into the system for a live demo. Please note that we have used the latest S/4HANA on-premise system, which is currently shipped to our customers. It has the state of S/4HANA 2021 FPS 0. In general, we are using three different kinds of statuses in our change record application: the change record status, the execution status, and the processing status. The change record status does mainly exist out of the different user statuses and user status actions. These two topics, status and status actions, are coming together in a status profile. What this is about, I will explain more in detail in the next slide. In addition to that, you are also able to maintain icons for status profile as well as enhancement the profile with a BF Plus based decision control. How all these things regarding the user status are set up in customizing, I will show later in the demo. Besides the change record status, we also have an execution status and a processing status available. The execution status gives you information about the current state of the change implementation. This allows approved master data scenarios on the change record. The execution status gets controlled via a business objects assignment in the status profile. The processing status can be assigned on a change item level and gives information about the state of the change item assigned to the change record. The processing status is hard-coded and can only be turned on or off. On the next slide, I will introduce you into the relation between user status and status actions and how they both coming together in a status profile. First, you need to identify which kind of different user status you want to have available. A user status is a special status where a change record can stay. This needs to get defined based on your business processes. Examples of user status you see here in the green boxes. Second, you need to define the status actions. Status actions are saying from which user status you need to perform which kind of action to push the change record to the next user status. So status actions are connecting user statuses with each other. Both, so actions and statuses, are defined as a status profile. As next, I will show you how the execution status stands in relation of the status network. In general, you can say that the execution status is dependent from the status of the change number in your business processes. So once no change number has been generated in the change record, we are in the change evaluation phase. This means that the execution status is in new. Once the change number has been created and is active, so the change is executed, then the execution status can be switched to in process. If a change number gets closed from the change record, then the execution status can be switched to closed. The control of the execution status is happening in the customizing of the user status action. There you say on which user status, which execution status gets set. Lastly, we'll see how the processing status is in relation to the execution status and status network. As already described in an earlier video, the processing status gets set on the change item level. Once the change record is in the evaluation phase, so a change number has not been generated and the execution status is new, then you are able to set the top 3 processing status for each item: change possible, change unnecessary, and change impossible. Is a change item set to change impossible, then the whole change record gets prevented to push into a change execution. Setting the processing status to possible or unnecessary, a push to the change execution is allowed and a change number can get generated. From change unnecessary, no further processing status can be set. From change possible, you can push the processing status in the execution phase to change started, change completed, error in change, or error corrected. The relation of the single status you see on the arrows in the chart. Once the execution status is closed and the change item is released, a push of the processing status to change released can happen. Let's now jump into the system to have a closer look how the status profiles are getting maintained. In the customizing, we are accessing the change record customizing settings of the same tree we already know. So logistics general, product lifecycle management, change records. Here we have the folder available of the user status. In the first customizing table, we are defining our user status. The user status is defined in which the change record can be stay. So in this customizing table for the user status field for change record, we are always using user status 01. As next, there's this shortcut for the user status. In our example, we are mainly using E0, E1, E2, and so on. The status text describes then the user status more in detail. For E0, we have, for example, maintained the user status text new, and for E1, we have maintained the user status text change request in review. The last column, we can then active or inactive the single user status. Switching to our change record application, you see the user status in the header area. In this example, it's just a newly created change record in the user status E0 new. Back in the customizing table, we're now switching to the user status actions. These are defined in the second table. So user status actions are saying from which user status you need to perform which kind of action to push the change record in the next user status. So for example, in the first column, we have here the user status action EA01 with the status action text submit request. The user status field for the change record is again always the user status 01 field. In the next column, we are defining in which user status the change record will be after this user status actions is executed. So in this example, after execution of the user status action submit request, we will have the change record in the user status E1. In the last two columns, we have defined our business objects. As already mentioned, these business objects are responsible for the execution status action. Back in our change record Fiori application, we can access the user status actions on the change status button. So here we see the user status actions of the submit request available. Back in our customizing, we're now switching to the next table of the define user status profiles. This table is bringing the user statuses and the user status actions together into one status profile. Here we are defining a user status profile shortcut. We are defining a status profile text. We are again defining the business objects, and as optional, we can set the inactive box. Going into this S02 status profile, in the first folder, we are defining the initial user status. So in this case, it's E0. In the next folder of the actions, we now can assign our user status actions to this status profile. So for example, this user status action of the submitting change request is assigned to the status profile. Selecting this action and going into the conditions folder, we see from which user status this status action is available. So here we see in the user status E0, the status action of submitting change request can be selected. Back in our Fiori application, we see exactly this behavior. So here, again, we are in the record status E0, and from there, via this change status button, we can access the user status action submit request. To give you another example, we are submitting this change record to the record status E1 by submitting the request. So as you see, now we are in status E1, change request in review. Let's see what kind of user status actions we have available here. So here it's the user status action request checked. Switching back into the customizing, we are double checking this. So our user status action was change request checked. We are checking the conditions folder and see that in user status E1, this status action change request checked is available. Based on the status profile, we for sure can also have multiple conditions for each status action available. This status profile S02 is assigned to our change record in the customizing folder of define engineering change record types. This was already covered in another video. Here you see that for this change record type, we have assigned this status profile to this change record. As next, I will show you how you can define icons for user status and process routes. This you will see in the next customizing table of the user-defined icons. By accessing this, you see that you define here per change record type, per status profile, per user status, which icon you will see. In the last two columns, you define then if this icon is available for the status and or for the process route by checking these checkboxes. In our example, we have here for user status E1 the sub icon to be reviewed available, as well as for the status and for the process route. Back in our Fiori application, you see the icons of the user status in this progress chart section. Here you see the status profile with the description and the icons available. As next, I will show you the change execution status. The change execution status is also available in the header area. In this case, the current change execution status is new. Defined is this execution status in the table of the defined user status actions. So here you see in the columns of the business objects that for which action which execution status gets set. So in this example, we see here that for the user status action EA06, the execution status gets set to in process. To give you another example, for the user status action EA08, the execution status gets set to completed. As next, I will show you the processing status. As already mentioned, the processing status is available on the change item level. In this case, we have here added a material with the processing status is initial. So by selecting the change item and clicking this change processing status, we see what kind of different processing status we have available. So in this case, change possible, change unnecessary, and change impossible. As already mentioned in the PowerPoint, if a change item is set to change impossible, the whole change record gets prevented to push it into the change execution. With change possible or change unnecessary, we are allowed to push the change record into the next execution phase. The setup of this processing status is happening in our main customizing table of the define engineering change record types. In the column of the processing status, we can enable or disable per change record type if the processing status is set or not. Thank you everyone. I hope I gave you an overview how the setup of change record status network is handled. You should now understand how user status and status actions are defined in a status profile, and how status profile relates to execution as well as to processing status.